In the spring of 2009, a county extension specialist named Dale Renner stood in the gravel lot of a small farm outside Coldwater, in the river bottom country of eastern Kansas, looked at the steel drums lined against the fence, and told Walter Boyd that he was wasting his life on garbage. Renner had a master's degree in agricultural economics and a clean white pickup with the university seal on the door. And he had driven out that morning as a favor, because Walter's daughter had asked him to talk some sense into her father. Renner used the word hobby 4 times in 20 minutes. He used another word, too, quieter, almost kind, and that word was the one that stuck. He looked at the drums of yellow fat, and he said gently, the way a man corrects a child, that this was sentiment. Not a business. Sentiment. 11 years later, in the fall of 2020, a senior buyer for a national department store chain signed a purchase order for Walter Boyd's soap and the number. Written on the bottom of that order, the annual figure was large enough that the woman who read it aloud at the kitchen table had to stop and read it again. I will tell you that number before we are done. I will tell you exactly what it was, and what it meant, and why a man who had been handed waste fat for free across 8 winters ended up holding a contract that the confident people had said could never exist. But the number is the end of the story, and we are at the beginning, and between them lies the part that matters, which is how. Let me tell you about Walter Boyd. Because to understand the soap, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to understand that he was known for 2 things in Coldwater. The first was that he almost never spoke at the co-op meetings. He would sit in the back with his cap in his hands and listen and leave. And in 30 years, some of his neighbors had never heard the sound of his voice. The second thing was that he could read fat. That is not a phrase most people understand. So stay with me, because it is the whole engine of what happened. Walter could take a handful of raw animal fat, work it between his fingers, smell it, hold it to the light, and tell you where it came from, how the animal had been fed, how clean the trim was, and whether it would make something fine or something foul. His grandmother had taught him. She had come from Bohemia in 1911 with a soap recipe and a way of looking at the world. And Walter had inherited both. If you have ever rendered fat in your own kitchen and ended up with a gray, sour, oily mess, here is why, and it is worth knowing. Animal fat is not one thing. The fat around the kidneys of a steer, called leaf fat or kidney fat, is the cleanest and hardest fat on the animal, low in the impurities that go rancid, dense, with the long, stable molecules that make a bar of soap hard and white, and slow to dissolve. The soft fat from elsewhere on the carcass is cheaper, more plentiful, and far worse for soap, full of the compounds that turn sour and smell of the slaughterhouse. The rendering plant did not separate these. The rendering plant melted everything together into one yellow commodity grease and sold it by the tanker for biodiesel and feed. To them, it was all the same, because their machine could not tell the difference, and a machine that cannot measure a difference will tell you the difference does not exist. Walter's hands could tell the difference. That was the whole secret, and it was a secret hiding in plain sight at the bottom of a steel drum. Now the drums. The Tri-County rendering plant sat 8 miles up the highway, and it had a problem that every rendering plant has, which is that the price of commodity tallow swings, and when it falls below the cost of trucking, the marginal fat becomes a liability. In 2009, a man at that plant named Cobb, who ran the intake yard and had known Walter's late wife, started leaving the trim he could not profitably move at the end of Walter's gravel drive. Clean leaf fat, mostly, pulled from local cattle. Cobb knew had been grass-finished fat. The plant valued it nothing because it was a rounding error in their tanker math. He left it because it was easier than hauling it. And because Walter had once fixed his truck for the cost of the part. To the plant it was waste they were glad to be rid of. To Walter, it was the best soap fat in 3 counties, arriving free at his gate every week. That is where Dale Renner came in. And I want to be fair to him, because this is not a story about a bad man. Renner was not cruel. He was a sincere and intelligent person who had spent his career helping farmers survive. And the things he believed had kept a great many families on their land. He believed in scale, in throughput, in cost per unit, and he was usually right. He looked at a 68-year-old widower making soap by hand in a converted milk house, selling 40 bars a month at the Coldwater farmers market for $4 apiece, and he did the arithmetic that his training told him to do. The numbers were small, the hours were enormous. By every measure Renner had ever been taught to respect, Walter Boyd was pouring his last good years into a sentimental dead end. So he said so, kindly, and he drove his clean white pickup back to town. And he did not think about it again for a long while. Walter did not argue. Walter rarely argued. He stood in his gravel lot with a drum of free fat behind him, and a man with a degree telling him he was a fool, and he said only one thing, and what he said was that the plant could not smell. Renner did not understand it. He smiled the patient smile of a man who has heard folk wisdom before, got in his truck, and left. But that one sentence held the entire argument that the next 11 years would settle. And the argument was this: there are 2 ways to know a thing. One is to measure it, to reduce it to a number you can put in a column and compare and scale. The other is to attend to it, to learn one particular thing so deeply across so many years that you perceive what no instrument is built to catch. Renner knew the first way. Walter knew the second. The plant, with all its tanks and pumps, knew only the first, and the plant could not smell. If you have ever wondered whether the slow, stubborn people in your own life were seeing something the confident people missed, hold that thought, because this is a story about exactly that. Walter went back inside to his grandmother's recipe, and the seasons began to turn. Let me tell you about the recipe, because the recipe is the inherited repository at the center of all this, and it deserves a careful look. It lived in a cloth-bound book the size of a hand, written in a mix of Czech and broken English in his grandmother's small, upright hand, and then continued, decades later, in Walter's own blockier print. It was not really a recipe, it was a record. Page after page of dated entries noting the source of each batch of fat, the season, the feed of the animals, the exact ratio of lye to fat, the water, the cure time, and then in a final column, a single word or two of judgment written months later when the bar was finished. Sweet, harsh, slick, true. His grandmother had understood something that the chemistry books would not formally describe until decades after she died, which is that soap is a reaction, called saponification, in which fat and lye trade places at the molecular level to become soap and glycerin, and that the quality of the fat going in determines everything about what comes out. Garbage fat, garbage soap, clean leaf fat, cured slow and cold, a bar that lasted, that lathered without stripping the skin, that smelled of nothing at all, which is the rarest and most valuable thing a soap can smell of. The lye mattered too, and here is the second mechanism, the one Walter's grandmother had carried from the old country. Most commercial soap is made fast and hot, the reaction forced to completion in hours under heat, so the maker can sell it the next day. Walter made his cold. He mixed the lye and the fat at just above room temperature, and then he waited. And the waiting was the craft. The reaction completed itself slowly over weeks. While the bars sat curing on slatted ash shelves in the old milk house, the water evaporating, the harsh edge of the unreacted lye softening into something mild enough for a newborn. A hot process bar is finished in a day and feels like it. A properly cold-cured bar takes 6 weeks and feels like silk. And there is no machine that can rush the 6 weeks, because the 6 weeks are not a step in the process. The 6 weeks are the process. To the rendering plant, time was cost. To Walter, time was the ingredient that cost nothing and could not be bought. There was a third thing his grandmother had known. She had learned, somewhere in Bohemia, where soap was a winter task done from the year's slaughter, that the temperature of the room mattered as much as the temperature of the mix. Too warm and the bars cured too fast on the outside and stayed soft and sour at the heart. Too cold and the reaction stalled and the lye stayed harsh. The old milk house, built of stone with a north wall, set half into the hill, held a steady cool that never moved more than a few degrees across a season. And that steadiness was why the bars cured true there, and would not have cured true in a heated building. Walter had not built the milk house. His grandfather had for cows in 1923. But Walter had understood the way you understand a thing, only by working in it for 40 years, that the building his family thought was obsolete was in fact the single most valuable piece of equipment on the farm. A curing chamber no engineer would have designed, and no spreadsheet could value. The conventional eye saw a falling down stone shed. Walter saw the one room in 3 counties where soap cured right, and there was the matter of the water. His grandmother's book specified rainwater, caught off the milkhouse roof in a stone cistern, and Walter still used it because the hard mineral water from the county well left a film in the bar and a faint scratch on the skin, while the soft rainwater let the soap stay clean and slick. None of this was magic. All of it was mechanism, every piece of it explicable in the plain language of chemistry, once you knew to look, and the whole of it was knowledge that had cost 100 years of attention to assemble, and could be thrown away in a single decision to do it faster. Across 2010 and 2011, the drums kept arriving at the gate, and Walter kept the milk house full of curing bars, and the fuss market kept buying its 40 bars a month, and by every external sign, Dale Renner had been correct. Walter's daughter, Ruth, worried about him from a distance. But there was another person in this story, whose path I have to set, running now beside Walter's, because the two of them would not be measured against each other until the end. And his name was Hollis Vance. Hollis farmed the adjoining section, 400 acres of good bottom ground, and he was everything Walter was not. He was loud and generous and forward-looking. 50 years old in 2010, and he had listened carefully to men like Dale Renner his whole life, and believed every word, because the words were sensible, and the words had built him a fine operation. In 2011, Hollis took out a substantial note, something north of $300,000, and built a confined hog operation, a long steel barn with automated feeding and climate control, financed against the equity in his land. The extension service helped him model it. The numbers were beautiful. Cost per pound of gain, throughput, projected margins. All of it penciled out to a comfortable profit, and for a few years it was. Let me be fair to Hollis the way the story is fair to Renner, because Hollis was not a fool either. He had done exactly what a careful, intelligent farmer was supposed to do. He had read the bulletins, attended the field days, run the spreadsheets the university handed him, and borrowed against good ground to build a machine that turned feed into pork at a cost per pound the old diversified farms could not touch. In a stable market he would have looked for the rest of his life, like the smart one. The barn went up that fall, gleaming and white, and the neighbors drove past, slow to look at it. And the automated feed line clicked on its timer through the night, like the heartbeat of the future. Hollis would lean on Walter's fence and shake his head at the old man hand-stirring lye in a milk house not unkindly, and tell him there was no future in 40 bars a month, that a man his age ought to either get big or get out. That sentiment was a fine thing on Sunday, but it did not service a note. He was right about the 40 bars. He did not know yet that he was wrong about the future. Then Ruth came home. Let me tell you about Ruth, because she is the one who carries the turn. Ruth Boyd had left Coldwater at 18 and gotten a degree in business, an MBA, and a good job in Kansas City, doing brand consulting for consumer products, and she had spent 15 years learning the exact language that Dale Renner spoke. When her own marriage ended in 2014, she came back to the farm to think, expecting to stay a month, and she walked into the milk house and saw her father at 63, doing what she had quietly been ashamed of her whole adult life. And she said the thing the educated heir always says. She told him with love and with a daughter's exasperation that he was leaving money on the table, that he had no margin, no scale, no brand, no story, that nobody in the actual market would ever pay what this was worth, because there was no way to make them see it. She was, in that moment, Dale Renner's student, speaking his language fluently. She was also, though she did not know it, about to spend 6 years being slowly and thoroughly proven wrong by her own father's hands. Ruth's first instinct was to fix the business the way her training told her to. She wanted to buy fat in bulk to guarantee supply, switch to a faster process to increase output, source a cheaper standardized tallow, so the cost per bar would drop. She built a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was excellent, and Walter listened to all of it the way he listened at the co-op meetings, with his cap in his hands, and then he took her out to the curing room and had her smell 2 bars. One was made from a drum of clean leaf fat Cobb had left in October. The other, Ruth, had made herself from a box of standardized commercial tallow she had ordered to prove her point about supply. She could not, at first, tell the difference by looking. Then she washed her hands with each, one after the other, and stood at the milkhouse sink a long time and did not say anything. The commercial bar left her skin tight and faintly sour. Her father's bar left her skin feeling like nothing had happened to it at all, clean and soft and quiet. That was the first crack in her certainty. A small one, a flicker of doubt about her own doubt, and she did not mention it. She washed with the 2 bars again, the next morning, privately, to be sure she had not imagined it, and she had not. The difference was real, and it was a difference her spreadsheet had no column for, because her spreadsheet measured cost per bar and ounces produced and hours of labor, and nowhere in all those careful rows was there a place to enter the way a bar felt on the skin 3 days later. She had been trained to improve the things she could measure. It had not occurred to her until she stood at that sink that the entire value of the thing might live precisely in what she could not. She stopped talking about the cheaper tallow. Let me tell you what Ruth did next, because it is where the 2 kinds of knowledge began, slowly to braid together instead of fight. She did not abandon her training. She put it in service of her father's hands instead of in argument against them. She kept the spreadsheet, but she filled it with his variables. She learned to read the cloth book. She started photographing the drums at the gate and noting which local herds the fat came from. And she discovered, because her father had always known it without writing it down, that the bars graded. True in the cloth book came overwhelmingly from grass-finished cattle on 3 particular neighboring farms, fat with a different molecular makeup than grain-finished animals. Harder and cleaner and more stable. The plant had been blending that premium fat into commodity grease at a loss for years. Ruth started, quietly, asking Cobb to keep those sources separate. She was beginning to build the thing she had told her. Father was impossible, which was a way to make the market see. By 2016, They were selling not 40 bars a month, but 400, through a small website Ruth built and a handful of regional shops at $9 a bar instead of 4. And the cloth book had a fourth generation of handwriting in it, because Ruth had begun keeping the dated source, records herself. Walter had a dog by then, a quiet brown heeler named Pug, who had wandered up the drive one winter and stayed. And Pug slept in the curing room among the racks where the air was warm and smelled of nothing, and followed Walter from the gate to the milk house and back across every day of the years that followed. I mention the dog now because you will want to remember him. Dale Renner, meanwhile, had been promoted, and in 2016, he came back through Coldwater for a regional agricultural conference. And he stopped at the farm because Ruth, building her brand, had invited him, hoping for a credential to put on her young company's materials. It was a public sort of moment, a small gathering of local producers Ruth had organized in the barn, and Renner, looking at 400 bars a month and a $9 price and a converted milk house, said the word again, the quiet one. He stood among Ruth's carefully arranged display, and he told the room, warmly, that this was a wonderful boutique, a lovely little boutique liability, charming, the kind of thing that could never survive contact with a real distribution channel, because it did not scale. He meant it as praise of a sort. Ruth felt her face go hot. Walter, in the back of his own barn with his cap in his hands, said nothing at all. But that was the second time the label had been fastened on in public, and it landed harder than the first, because this time it was said in front of the neighbors and in front of the daughter, who had once said the same fling thing herself. Which brings us to Hollis Vance and the hog barn, because by 2017 the beautiful numbers had begun to turn. Let me tell you what efficiency costs when it breaks. A confined operation is a marvel of throughput, precisely because it removes every buffer, every redundancy, every inefficiency, until it runs on the thinnest possible margin, at the highest possible volume. That is its genius, and that is its fragility. When hog prices fell in 2017 and feed costs rose at the same time, Hollis had no slack anywhere in the system to absorb it. The same automation that had made him money in good years was a fixed cost that did not care about prices in bad ones. He refinanced once. He leaned on Walter's fence less often, and when he did, he had stopped shaking his head. The structural shock, when it came, did not come for Hollis as weather. It came as a number on a market screen, and a disease in the national herd that crashed prices for a year. And it came for the whole confined hog corridor of the county at once, because they had all been built to the same model on the same advice, with the same thin margins. Through the back half of 2018 and into 2019, 3 of the large financed operations around Coldwater failed. The land went to auction. To the bank, these were assets to be liquidated. To the families, they were something else entirely. Hollis held on longer than the others, because he was stubborn, and because his ground was good. But in the spring of 2019, the note came, due in a year he could not pay it, and a man Walter had known for 40 years stood at the same fence, where he had once preached the future and could not finish his sentences. The arithmetic of those 2 years is worth setting side by side, because the contrast is the whole verdict in miniature. Hollis Vance lost 2 of his 400 acres to the auction block, and carried, at the worst of it, a debt of roughly $280,000 against an operation that in 2018 cleared almost nothing. The 3 failed barns in the corridor represented, between them, better than 1,000 acres of good Kansas bottom ground sold off in a single 18-month window, families scattered, equipment auctioned for cents on the dollar to buyers from out of state. That was what the efficient path cost when the shock found its thin margin. And across the property line on the same dates, in the same falling market, the old man making garbage soap in a stone shed sold 400 bars a month at $9 apiece, owed not $1 to any bank, and never noticed the hog crash at all, because his entire operation ran on waste fat that cost nothing, and a building his family had already paid for in 1923. The same shock that took 1,000 acres did not cost Walter Boyd a single bar. That is not luck. That is the difference between a system built to run on no slack and a system that was nothing but slack, patient and diversified, and owing nobody anything. Walter did not gloat. Understand that this is the center of the man. He had been told he was a fool by the entire confident apparatus of which Hollis was a faithful member, and now that apparatus was breaking the neighbor he liked, and Walter felt no vindication in it at all, only a plain old grief for a good man caught in a bad machine. What he did was quieter and harder. He walked across the property line one evening with Pug at his heel, and he did not offer advice because advice was the thing that had ruined Hollis. He offered work. He told Hollis that the soap operation had grown past what two people could supply, that he needed someone who understood animals and could help him build relationships with the grass-finishing cattlemen whose fat made the difference, and that the job paid, and that he would consider it a favor. It was not charity dressed as a job. It was a job. Hollis Vance, who had once modeled a $300,000 barn, came to work sourcing waste fat for an old man's boutique, and it kept his family on a corner of their land. And within a year, he was good at it, because it turned out that attending to particular animals was a thing he had always known how to do and had been taught to be ashamed of. Now, the soap. By 2019, Ruth had spent 5 years turning her father's craft into something the market could finally read without lying about what it was. She had not standardized it. She had done the opposite. She had built the entire brand around the very things, Dale Renner said, could not scale. The single-source local fat, the named farms, the cold cure, the 6 weeks, the handwriting in the cloth book reproduced on the label, the fact that the bars smelled of nothing, as nothing had been added to cover what cheap fat would have needed covering. She had taken the appearance of poverty, the milk house, the old man, the free waste fat, and shown it to the market as exactly what it was, which was wealth. The rendering plant had been too coarse to perceive, and in the fall of 2019, a buyer noticed. Let me tell you about the buyer, because in this niche, the outside judge is the figure who finally converts local stubbornness into recognized worth, and her name was Marta Quinn. She was a national department store chain, the kind of person who tested 400 products a season and rejected nearly all of them, and she had built her reputation on an almost frightening discernment about what was real and what was a story pretending to be real. She came to Coldwater in October of 2019 because a small shop in Kansas City kept selling out of a soap, and she came expecting to find the usual thing, a clever brand and a mediocre product. She had seen 100 farms dressed up for buyers, 100 old men hired to stand near a vat. For the photographs, 100 brands whose authenticity was a costume. She knew the costume cold. What she did not yet know was what it looked like when there was no costume at all. She spent a day at the farm. She read the cloth book, turning the pages slowly. The Czech and the broken English, and the 4 generations of handwriting, and the single-word judgments in the final column. Sweet, harsh, slick, true. She watched Walter work a handful of fat between his fingers and name the farm it came from before she had told him anything about it, and then watched him do it again with a second handful and a third, and be right each time. And Marta, who had spent 20 years learning to detect exactly the difference between attention and performance, went very quiet. She has to see the curing room. She stood among the racks in the cool stone air that smelled of nothing and ran her hand along a shelf of bars. 6 weeks into their cure, and she did not say anything for a long time. At the end of the day, she washed her hands at the milkhouse sink, the same test Ruth had failed to articulate 5 years before, and she stood there a long moment with her eyes closed. Then she asked Walter one question. She did not ask about volume or margin or scale. She asked him how long the cure was, and Walter said 6 weeks. And Marta Quinn, who could have crushed the price of a small operation simply by naming a large order, said the thing that turned the whole story, which was that she would not ask him to make it faster. And she would not ask him to make more than the fat could honestly supply. And she would build the order around his constraint instead of against it. She had spent her whole career, she said, looking for the thing that could not be faked, and she had found that the only reliable sign of it was a maker who would refuse a bigger number to protect the work. Walter had refused nothing yet, but she could see that he would. The order came on paper in the fall of 2020. Ruth read it at the kitchen table under the single hanging light, with Walter across from her and Pug asleep on the floor between them. And she read the annual figure, and she stopped, and she read it again. $240,000. For a moment, no one at the table said anything. The number sat there in the lamplight, larger than the hog barn note that had broken 3 families, earned not by scale, but by refusing it. And it landed with a force out of all proportion to its size. Because it was not really a number about money. It was a verdict. It was the market. Through the one buyer qualified to read it, finally agreeing with a dead bohemian grandmother and an old man's hands and 11 years of free fat against the unanimous opinion of every confident person who had ever measured the operation and found it wanting. Walter looked at the paper a long time. He did not say, "I told you so." He had never in his life said, "I told you so." What he said finally was that the plant still could not smell, and then he reached down and put his hand on the dog's head, and that was all. Dale Renner heard about it the way news travels in a small county, and to his great credit, he did the thing the sincere are capable of and the cruel are not. He came back to the farm one more time, in the winter of 2021, in an ordinary car now, retired. And he stood in the curing room, among the racks of bars that smelled of nothing, and he did not make excuses. He told Walter that he had been wrong, plainly the way a decent man says it, and then he asked a question, and the question was the measure of the whole long argument, finally settled. He asked Walter to explain how he could tell the leaf fat from the rest. He asked to be taught. He was 71 years old, and he stood in an old man's milkhouse and asked the fool to teach him. And Walter, who held no grudges, because grudges were a kind of measuring too, pulled a handful of fat from the day's drum and put it in Dale Renner's soft, clean hands and began. Which brings us to what happened after. The part that mattered most to Walter, who never once in his life called himself wealthy. He did not scale. Marta Quinn had offered to take everything he could make, and more, and Walter capped the order at what the honest local fat could supply, and refused to buy standardized tallow to meet a larger number, because a larger number made by worse fat would have made the contract a lie. Instead, he did something else. He began to teach. The grass-finishing cattlemen whose herds made the difference, 3 farms at first, and then 7, found that their cattle were suddenly worth more because their fat was, and the rendering plant, which had been throwing that premium away into commodity grease for a generation, started separating it and selling it to Walter at a fair price. So that even Tri-County, the very plant that had left it free at his gate, because it valued it at nothing, came around at last to the truth that the difference was real. Hollis Vance ran the sourcing and eventually bought back 2 of his lost quarters with the wages. Ruth formalized the cloth book into a real record, took over the brand entirely, and kept the company exactly the size her father's hands and the county's honest fat would allow, refusing 3 offers from people who wanted to buy it and make it big, because making it big was the one thing that would have destroyed the only thing it had. And in time, a granddaughter, Ruth's niece, came to spend summers learning to read fat in the milk house. The 5th pair of hands to hold the work, and the cloth book grew a 5th generation of handwriting. Let me tell you what this story is about, now that you have the whole of it. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they are always at war, and most of the time the loud kind wins. One kind is wide and shallow and confident. It measures what is easy to measure, reduces the world to numbers it can compare and scale, and finance, and it is genuinely powerful and genuinely useful. And it is right far more often than the people it dismisses would like to admit. The other kind is narrow and deep and quiet. It learns one particular thing, one piece of ground or one craft, or the difference between 2 handfuls of fat, so completely and across so many years that it perceives what no instrument is built to catch. The first kind builds the rendering plant and the hog barn and the spreadsheet. The second kind reads the fat. And when a structural shock comes, and it always comes, it is the deep, narrow knowledge that bends without breaking, because it was never rigid enough to break. The rendering plant was not wrong that the fat was cheap. It was wrong about what cheap meant. It mistook the price it could measure for the value it could not. And it left the best soap fat in 3 counties at an old man's gate for 8 years, and called it garbage because its machine could not smell. And a system will always tell you that what it cannot measure does not exist. Walter Boyd knew better, because his grandmother had known better, because she had carried across an ocean the one thing no machine can be taught, which is the patience to attend to a particular thing until you truly know it. The plant had every advantage of scale and capital and science, and it threw away, for free, week after week, the very thing that would have made it money, because it had built itself to see only what its tanks could measure, and the fat that mattered was invisible to a tank. That is the whole of it. The drums stopped coming free a long time ago, but Walter kept one of the original empty ones standing by the gate, rusted now. And Pug grew old lying in the curing room where the air was warm and smelled of nothing at all. And on the evening the old dog finally did not get up. Walter sat with him on the slatted floor among the racks until morning. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are 2 different things. The plant could not smell. The old man could.